George Sedano does a great job with ESPN NBA Lockdown podcast. You can get the app and, of course, on iTunes. Nacion on ESPN2, 5 p.m. Monday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, so check that out as well. Always good to catch up with George. How you doing, pal?
Hey, Rich, I'm good. And yourself?
I'm doing well. We're getting heavy into the NBA talk, and I know it's a good time of year for you guys. All right, first question, and I'm sure this is the generic one that you really like to start the interview. I'll throw you the softball. If you're a Cleveland Cavaliers fan, I guess the question would be, how concerned would you be that you get a little worried that they can't ratchet up this defense because they've been god-awful throughout the regular season?
I wouldn't really be too worried getting to the Eastern Conference. I feel like Boston is one of these teams that maximizes itself in the regular season, but come playoff time, I feel like they're going to have some struggles. I actually don't think that their first series against Chicago is going to be a cakewalk. Boston, that is. Whereas I think the Cavs will get through the East relatively easy. I think the problem the Cavs are going to have is in the finals, where they're going to face a team, whether it's the Warriors or the Spurs, more than likely, that has tremendous defense themselves and offensively move the ball as well as anybody. And that's where you're going to run into problems when you're Cleveland, because defense is about building habits in the NBA. And you don't have a lot of teams outside of the top 10 in defensive efficiency that win titles. There's only been a couple. Mm-hmm. And I don't see this Cavs team being that because, first of all, they would be the worst defensive team to reach the NBA Finals, and I think they'll do that. So they sure as hell would be the worst defensive team to win an NBA Finals. I look at this team and I see a worse version of the 2014 Miami Heat, who had a bunch of aging role players who were slow-footed, who had slipped some on defense. Now, that team was an elite-level defense for a number of years, and they slipped to about 12 in defensive rating. And I remember having this conversation with Shane Battier after that series, and he basically said, I made the mistake of looking at our defensive rating heading into the playoffs, and I realized, we're in trouble. Now, look, we saw that series, and through 2 games, we all thought we were in for another 7-game series. So, and then all of a sudden, games 3, 4, and 5 were complete blowouts. So it can happen like that. Like the first 2 games at Golden State or at San Antonio can be competitive, and then they can just wipe the floor with them potentially moving forward. We've seen that happen, and I feel like this Cavs team has a lot of that in them, and they're not as good defensively as that Miami team was.
So you see, I thought Cleveland might have a bump in the road. I still like them to get through the Eastern Conference, but you like them. I don't want to say cakewalk. You're pretty confident they're going to represent the Eastern Conference again in the NBA Finals.
Yeah, I don't see anybody challenging them. Like, look.
What about Washington, George? What about Washington? No, really? No, I tell you, I love the guard play.
They have so little playoff experience. Beyond Wall and Beal and Gortat, like so little that it's their whole bench is a bunch of young dudes, and that's where they'll get exposed. I think Toronto, actually, of all the teams in the East, has the best shot of giving them a challenge because they've added 2 really good defenders in Serge Ibaka and PJ Tucker, but I still don't think they're good enough because I don't trust Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan in that series, particularly Lowry. Like Lowry's playoffs have been terrible throughout his career.
You're right.
And he's coming off a wrist injury. So I just don't see anyone in the East challenging them. Honestly, I think this could be the least talented Eastern Conference as far as the good teams having, or the alleged good teams having, like a superstar type player on their team that LeBron has faced in a long time, because even those Pacer teams that he faced with Paul George, when he was amazing, he was surrounded by a number of really good players at that time. Like David West was still a really good player in the league at that point. Roy Hibbert was a good role player, and they had guys on that team that they could rely on. Lance was playing really well at that point in his career. So, but I don't even see this Boston team, having anything like that. Like Isaiah Thomas is going to get completely exposed in the postseason too, because he can't defend. He's one of the worst defenders in the league. Like you can create a game plan to just go at him, and you're going to put him in a blender basically. Like he's going to be spinning around.
So let me ask you a question though. With that, and we know about the fourth quarter, the scoring prowess, and you look at Brad Stevens. It seems as though a lot of people still criticize him. Young coach, what have they done? So say they get bounced early, is it still on Stevens, or is it just because, as you just mentioned, bad matchups and you got players that are going to get exposed?
Yeah, I think they've maximized. I think Brad has done a great job maximizing that team. That team is not all that talented. Like Isaiah Thomas is a good player. I don't think he's a great player. I think he's kind of a one-dimensional player, and Brad has kind of made him look a lot better than he is. They've got some nice complementary pieces on that team, and I think Horford is a good complementary piece on a good team, but he's also had some slippage in his game. So I just don't think they're good enough. I would say that's more on Ainge. And look, Ainge, to his credit, has taken a long view on this thing. He didn't pull the trigger for Paul George, even though a lot of people criticized him, including me. I was like, you're kind of a hoarder here. I don't know what you're doing with all these picks if you're not going to make
really
this kind of move.
Try talking to NBA in our backyard with the Sixers. Don't talk about hoarding until you talk about what the Sixers.
Well, but I actually like what the Sixers are doing. Like, I actually believe that Colangelo will get that thing headed in the right direction because they've got young talent. Like, I'll look. I know he only played 31 games, but what I saw from Embiid was really impressive.
Oh, no doubt. And Sarge, listen, Dario. I think Dario benefited the most.
He's a nice player. Yeah, he's a nice player. I don't think he's a cornerstone, but I think he's a really good complementary player on a good team eventually. So, yeah, like I just think that Boston is ill-equipped to handle this. They remind me, Rich, of the Denver Nuggets the year Melo left.
Okay.
George Karl won Coach of the Year, and they won 57 games without Melo, as Andre Iguodala was their best player. And then they got exposed in the first round. Now, Boston's not going to do that because the East isn't as powerful as the West was back then, but they're not going to win the East.
I got to mention, I'll give you the shameless plug and pop on the podcast. My producer, Josh, a loyal listener, he says he understands Heat Island is upset about not making playoffs. By the way, that's Bush League last night by the Nets. And that's a great job by Spoelstra the second half of the season with that Miami team. But that is just flat out. I'm sorry. You roll over and you give a team another opportunity to get in.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like, my whole thing was, and the Kings, by the way, did the same thing out west. They sat a bunch of guys while they're locked into their positions in the inverse standings. Clearly, the Nets don't even have the pick.
Right.
So I don't understand any of that. Yeah, that was kind of weird. Like, I get LeBron resting. I get, the Warriors resting people, Pop resting people. But when you're the Nets or the Kings, you shouldn't be resting anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's bad. And Lopez is the only player that actually gives them something the fans want to see. You can argue probably the best player in franchise history. And then to close out the season, let's just play Matador and just roll over. It's a bad look. I know we only got you for a couple more minutes, but what is your whole sentiment on the players resting and how we saw this as the season transpired, and I always harken back and look. I know Magic and Michael and Scotty and Isaiah and all these guys. It's hard when not every year they played 82, but yet I never saw a situation where they actually openly welcomed or wanted to rest and sit. But what's your sentiment on today's players doing it?
Well, I think like anything, we evolve, right? We get more data. We get modern medicine has evolved. And I think Greg Popovich said it best. I got to extend Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili's career out to 19 seasons. And that's because I was proactive about rest for many, many years. And maybe we would have seen those guys play longer careers had that just been something that was more top of the mind. And because once guys start breaking down physically, I think that the biggest predictor of future injury is past injury.
Right.
So, and that's something that Greg has taken to heart. And Pop, look, man, there's a reason he's the smartest coach in the game. Okay, and he did that. And very quickly, Eric Spoelstra started doing that when he had LeBron and Bosh and Wade and those guys. They had Wade on a maintenance program, for God's sake, one of those years that they won. So it is the smart thing to do when you are a team that has championship aspirations and has aging veteran superstar types. And it's also, look, it's baseball, they do it with young kids all the time, particularly pitchers. There are a lot of guys on pitch counts and innings limits and things like that because we've learned that young guys, particularly in baseball, tend to blow out their arms quickly. And if they do it early in their career because they're pitching too many innings, then it becomes hard to then get them back on track, right? Like, look at Steven Strasburg, right? That's a perfect example. So The Dodgers are doing that with this kid they have now, Julio Urias. I mean, the kid's a phenom, right? He was the guy the White Sox wanted in the Chris Sale deal. But the Dodgers have given him extended spring. They're not even bringing him up till May, even though he's probably going to be the second-best pitcher after Kershaw. But that's the smart thing to do. So it's not like basketball is really the only sport doing this and has evolved. It's just smarter. Like this notion of, back in my day, I used to, go walk 6 miles through the snow uphill.
Are you making fun of me right now? I thought we were in the same age bracket. Am I the old man on the porch?
I think you are. Like, you just have to understand that life evolves.
I know. I don't like change sometimes. I want these guys out there. I want these guys out there sometimes.
Right, but do you want them out there for one singular game, or would you rather have them extend their careers by 2 or 3 years?
No,
I'd rather have that.
Certainly extend their careers. I do think with the other sports, it is apples and oranges to some extent, but you make a valid point. 2 more quickies for you. All right. I asked you your MVP before we get out of here, but as far as the Western Conference, you mentioned San Antonio. Oh, by the way, just going about their business. I mean, look, does it seem as though San Antonio and Golden State on another collision course here, or if there's a team to upset the apple cart in the Western Conference, who would it be?
I think they're on a collision course. I think if there's a team that could upset the apple cart, it's Houston. Just because Mike D'Antoni's a really good coach, man. Like, I know he got a bum rap with the Knicks and the Lakers, but those rosters didn't necessarily fit what he wanted to do, and there was always kind of that struggle and tug of war there. Now he's got a roster and a GM who completely understands what he wants in Daryl Morey, and here's the result, right? He's made James Harden into I want to say, at least for one singular season, a better version of Steve Nash by a long shot. So, yeah, like I think that they could be the one team that could upset the apple cart as far as San Antonio is concerned. But, yeah, like I still think it's Spurs, Warriors. I mean, we've been kind of clamoring for that, and I'm hopeful we get that this year.
About 20 seconds, your MVP.
I've got Harden for the reasons I mentioned. And look, basically it boils down to this. I know people want to talk about triple-doubles and Westbrook. Harden has had basically the same season Westbrook's had with more assists and 2 less rebounds. And he's won more games. And you know what? The players around him, I'll give you a quick example. Ryan Anderson and Eric Gordon lead the league in open three-point looks. Trevor Ariza, I believe, is 6th in the league in open three-point looks. You know why?
Yep, because they're all
James Harden.
Absolutely.
He's making guys around him better.
That's a fair point.
That's
a fair point. That's a fair point. Gordon's having an outstanding year. All right, don't forget George Sedano again, ESPN NBA Lockdown podcast on the app and iTunes. Nacion on ESPN 2, 5 p.m. Eastern on Monday. And I'll try to change by the next time we talk.
Sounds good, man.
Hey, always good to talk to you, pal. Be well.
Yep.
Good stuff.
Take care.
All right. So good stuff.